Hi everyone, this is an intro to the Nonlinear Animation Editor, or NLA, in Blender. I assume that you have a basic understanding of keyframes, action curves, and so on. If you don't, watch the previous video. The goal of this video is to unconfuse the NLA. There are just a few concepts in this editor that you need to grasp, and that will determine if you have a nice experience working with nonlinear animation or a painful one. I admit this video won't be cool. We'll be using a simple cone object again, but that will give us a good foundation and that will enable us to do something more interesting using rigged characters in the next video. If you like my stuff and want to support me, you can do so on Gumroad or Patreon. Okay, I'll start with a new scene. I'm going to create cone or any other object and organize my scene a bit. I'm going to want a timeline, action editor, and NLA. And now I'm going to create 3 very simple actions which will help us explain a lot of what is going on in the NLA. I want one action where the cone is just moving on the x-axis. So I'm going to create a new action and call it move x. I want to show the end panel item, and now I'm going to insert a new keyframe on frame 1 for location. And then move the timeline to frame 50, for example. Move my cone on the x-axis and insert another location keyframe. It is very important to note that even though I'm only moving the cone on the x-axis, I'm inserting keyframes for all axes. You'll see why this is important when we start working with the NLA. Now I'm going to move to frame 1 again, create a fake user for this action and unlink it. Then I'm going to create a new action, call it move Z, insert a keyframe again at the default position for location, and then again move to frame 50, for example, move the cone up and insert another location keyframe. Again, we only have movement on one axis, but I am keyframing the whole set of location axes. Now again move to frame 1, create a fake user, unlink, and create another action, and I'm going to call this one just rotate. On frame 1, I'm going to insert one rotation keyframe by pressing I, and then go to frame 50, for example, and I want my object to rotate 360 degrees on the y-axis. I can do that manually in the viewport, but it's actually easier to just insert 360 here for the y-axis, and then while my mouse is here, I'm going to press I, and that will create a new keyframe. Now let's start moving these actions to the NLA. I'm going to set fake user for this action and then switch to move X. If I expand the data for the cone here, you'll see that we have animation data, and under it is the move X action as the current action. Now I'm going to press the push down button to move this action to the NLA. And notice how it was automatically unlinked, which also made it disappear from the animation data. And instead, we got a new NLA track. You're probably not going to view this object data often, but it is useful to be aware of it. Among other things, it is showing you what animation data is driving your object. So now I'm going to set move Z as the active action. Now we have an active action under animation and an NLA track. Having this combination of an active action and NLA is actually one of the more confusing situations that you can have while working with the NLA. I'm going to try to explain how to deal with this in this video. But for now, I'm just going to push down this action down to the NLA as well. And then again, I'm going to set the active action to rotate and push it down as well. Now we have a very simple NLA setup, but this will allow us to explain and understand some of the most important and confusing parts of this editor. First, let's define some terms. On the right in the NLA editor, we have what is called tracks. Tracks are similar to Photoshop layers. It is not a perfect analogy, but just like Photoshop layers, tracks are stacked from bottom to top. So the tracks further up are modifying the tracks below them. Actions, once they are pushed down to the NLA, become these rectangular strips. Those are called action strips. I may get sloppy with the naming and call them either strips or actions or even animations. Also, instead of tracks, I may say layers, but I think it will be clear what I'm talking about. Okay, let's look at the tracks first. There are a few things that we can do with them. I can rename them by double-clicking on them. This is entirely for organizational purposes. The name should explain what kind of actions or what kind of effect you're trying to achieve with this layer or track. In this case, we have just one action strip on each track, so let's name the tracks the same as the layers. This one will be move X, move Z, and rotate. Now, if I scrub through this action here that we have in the NLA, you'll see that the cone goes up while rotating. This is the result of the current combination of actions that we have here. My goal with this video will be to explain why this is the result you see and how to change this behavior. And then we'll be able to easily apply this same approach to more complex scenes. But anyway, back to the tracks. Each of them has this checkbox. If I uncheck the rotate, the cone will no longer rotate. It will just go up. That is because the rotation action was now disabled. This checkbox disables all strips on this track. In this case, I only have one action on this track, but if I had more, then all of them would have been disabled. Notice how the rotation strip was surrounded by a dotted line. This in the NLA means that the action is not being evaluated, that it is disabled. I wish the visual cue was more obvious, but it is what it is. So dotted line means disabled. If I disable the move Z track, for example, then the lowest track, the move X track, will become visible and we'll be able to play this movement on the X-axis. And now if I tick back the rotate track, then I'll have movement on the X-axis while the cone is spinning. One thing to note is that if I go to the middle of the action and then untick the rotate track and then scrub through the timeline, you'll notice that the cone stays in this rotated state. And the reason for that is really not that complicated. But if you don't take the time to understand it, it will confuse the hell out of you when working on more complex scenes. I'll do my best to explain this behavior. But let's activate back all of the tracks and then look at this lock icon that we have as well. Locking a track will prevent you from doing any changes to this track. So if I lock the move Z track, I'll no longer be able to move this strip that I have on it. You know, the other strips I can just drag with the mouse and move, but this one I can't. Also, if this was unlocked, I can move a track and drag it on this upper track. But if I undo and lock this track, then I'm no longer able to move this track onto the locked track. And this can be useful when you want to avoid accidental changes to a certain track in your NLA. I'm going to unlock all. And finally, let's look at this star icon here. The star simply makes one of the tracks the only active animation for this object. If I start the move X track, then I'll only have the movement on the X-axis. If I start the move Z track, my object will only move on the Z-axis. And if I start the rotate, it will only rotate. So starring is similar to if I unstar it here and then uncheck all tracks except for one, then we'll have something similar. But if I had many tracks here, that could be very tedious, and so I can do it with just one click by clicking the star icon. I see this feature as a way to preview one of the tracks independently from all others. At least that's how I use it. So for my final animation, I'll want to remove any stars and just have all my tracks in unstarred mode. I'm going to tick all actions again. Let's move to the next important topic, which is blending and mixing actions. As you probably understand, mixing actions is one of the main strengths of this NLA system. In our simple example, we are already mixing the location and rotation actions. So the cone is moving up and rotating, which is a mix of the move Z and rotate actions that we created earlier. If I disable the move Z track, then again the cone will be moving sideways and spinning. But the two movement action X and Z don't seem to be mixing. So let's try to figure out what's going on. For this purpose, we'll introduce another feature of the NLA, which is blending modes. I'll uncheck the rotation track and select the move Z action strip. And then I'll expand this side panel, which is similar to the N panel in the 3D view. The shortcut for it is again N. And let's move to the strip tab. We'll ignore the other two tabs and I'll talk about them later. In this tab, you'll see options for the active strip, for the strip that we have selected here. You'll see the name of the strip that you're editing at the top. And now we're going to focus on this blending option. By default, it is set to replace, but we have a few other options to choose from, like combine, add, subtract, and multiply. And here we can return to our Photoshop layer analogy. In Photoshop, if I have a layer filled with red color, and then I create a new layer and fill it with green, then the upper layer will completely cover the lower one. And then we have blending modes like multiply, add, subtract, etc. NLA action blending is similar, except that we are not blending RGB values, but whatever properties are keyframed in the actions. The default option replace is like the default blending mode in Photoshop. It completely covers any values below it, unless we reduce the opacity. That is something that we can do in the NLA as well, but I'll talk about it later. So that is why when we have these two strips one over the other, the upper one overrides the lower one. Since both have location X, Y, Z keyframes, whichever strips is above will completely replace the lower one. And this mixing of values is being evaluated on every frame as we go through the timeline. So on frame 1, we have something like this. And then if you move to frame 25, for example, we'll have values like this. As you can see, the first action has some sort of value for the X movement, but it is being replaced by the value set in the upper action. And that value is 0 constantly throughout the whole action. And so the final value for the X movement of this object, of this cone, is constantly 0. And that is why the cone is only moving up and not sideways. If I now switch the blending mode to add and preview my action, you'll see that the cone is moving diagonally. So the X and Z movements were now combined. If we look at my improvised graph again, this is what is happening. On frame 1, we have the object in the initial position, because both actions that we are mixing are set to 0, 0, 0 at this point of time. If we move forward in time, at any frame, for example 20, we'll see that the XYZ values of each strip are being added together. And that allows the X value to show through. And that is how we get this mixing of the movement. The add blending mode is one of the most commonly used ones in the NLA, and you'll be using it a lot when mixing animations. Another blending mode that we have is subtract. This mode, instead of adding the values together, it will subtract any value of move Z from move X. And that gives us this inverted movement in the Z axis. You can kind of think of this mode as inverting any value that the strip holds. We also have multiply. Can you guess what will happen if I set the blending mode to multiply? The object will stay completely still, because each action has a value that is a constant 0 throughout this action. And anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So all XYZ values are zeroed out throughout the whole animation. And finally there is combine. This mode is similar to the add mode, but instead of simple addition of the values, it uses more complex formulas that also depend on what is being blended. So it will use one formula for location values, another for rotation, and a different one for scale, and so on. So most of the time you'll be using either add or replace. But of course you can experiment with the other modes and find special uses for them. Okay, let's set move Z to add and activate rotation. And now we'll have this diagonal movement while the cone is also spinning. However, if I select the rotate strip, you'll see that blending is still set to replace. So why isn't it overriding the previous actions? That is very simple actually. It is because the rotate action does not have any location keyframes, it only has rotation ones. And so the calculation simply passes through this action and makes it into the final result. Similarly, because move X and move Z do not have any rotation keyframes, the calculation simply passes through these actions. It finds the rotation keyframes in the rotate strip and then that becomes the final result. Now, if I set the rotate action as the active action in the action editor and just add one location keyframe for it, and then just unlink the action, this edit will be reflected in the action strip, because the action strip simply holds an instance of the action. And now if I scrub through the timeline, the cone will be just spinning in place. And that is because we now have a location keyframe in the rotate action. And since blending is set to replace, it is overriding anything below it. One thing that can kind of confuse you is we only added a single location keyframe at frame 1. So why is it overriding the entire length of the other actions? That is easy to see in the graph editor. So I'll reorganize my layout a little bit and switch to graph editor here. Actually, before that, I should activate my action in the dope sheet action editor, activate rotate, and then switch to graph editor. And I'll hide my rotation keyframes and just focus on the location ones. And you'll see that even though we just have a single keyframe, it produces this line that extends in either direction into infinity. If I create another location keyframe here on another frame, you'll see that the last keyframe always extends into infinity in the positive direction, and the first keyframe always extends into infinity in the negative direction. And that is why a single location keyframe made such a difference in the NLA. And when mixing actions in the NLA, you should always be aware of what is being mixed in your action strips. Now, I don't need these location keyframes, so I'm just going to clear them by right-clicking here and choosing Clear Keyframes. And I'll switch back to the dope sheet and action editor. One more option that can cause confusion is extrapolation. Let's unlink the rotate action and disable the rotate track, and the Z strip I'm going to set to replace again. So now we just have a up and down movement, and let's drag the X movement strip and place it next to the move Z one. Now if I scrub through this timeline, I'll have the cone going up, and then as soon as I reach move X, it will switch to the move X action. Okay, I think that is intuitive to understand. Now if I simply move the move X action on the track below it, but I'll keep the general timing, then let's see what happens. I'll scrub again through the move Z action, and as we expect, it moves up. But then when we reach the move X action, nothing happens. So why is that? There's nothing about the X movement, so it should play, right? But this is because of the strip extrapolation options. If I select move Z and look under extrapolation, you'll see that it is set to hold. Hold means that the pose at the beginning of a strip will extend back into infinity, and the end will extend forward in time into infinity. This is similar to what we just saw with curves and keyframes, and the way the first and the last one kinda extended back and forth in time. But unlike curves, this behavior can be turned off for the strips in the NLA. And we do that using the extrapolation options. Before we change it, notice the brownish color that extends in both directions from the move Z action strip. Let's change extrapolation to hold forward, and you'll see that the brownish color disappeared from behind this action strip. We don't have anything behind this strip, so the effect of it is kind of hard to see. So let's select the final option, which is nothing, and you'll see that the brownish color disappeared from the end of the action strip. Now if I play through this action, I have the movement up of the cone. Then as I go in the space between these two actions, my cone will kind of weirdly jump to its default position. And then as I move into the move X strip, we'll see the move X action. So this is extrapolation. It defines whether an action strip holds its initial and last pose. But notice again how after we go past the move Z action, the cone jumps to a default position. And that is one of the main reasons why we want this kind of extrapolation. You generally want your object to stay in place after an action is over, instead of jumping to some sort of arbitrary default position. Okay, let's return this strip to its initial position, and then we'll move to the next topic. Something else that can be confusing is having strips in the NLA which create some sort of animation and then adding a new active action. So a combination between NLA and an active action. Let's give it a try. I'm going to create a new action here by clicking new, and this new action is automatically placed in the NLA as a special kind of track. It is special because it is always on the top of the stack. And also it doesn't contain any strips. It just contains the action, the keyframes, that are being edited in the action editor. But other than that, it behaves the same as other tracks. If I click on this track, I'll see the options for it. And as you can see, it also has extrapolation and blending options. Another way to see these options is if I select any of the strips and then move to the edited action tab, I'll see the exact same options. Now I still don't have any keyframes in this new action that I created. So if I scrub through the timeline, I'll see the exact action that I have created in the NLA. Let's set this strip to add and activate rotate so we have something more interesting. And now we have the cone moving diagonally and spinning. If I go to frame 1 and set one location keyframe for my new action, then that will override the movement in the NLA clip and the cone will just spin in place. That is because blending is set to replace and we just added a new location keyframe and that is overriding any movement that is on the tracks below it. If I go to frame 20 and move the cone a little bit and record another location keyframe, then we'll have this new movement and at the same time the cone is rotating. This is because we have no rotation keyframes here and so the rotation keyframes from the track below are coming through. If I set the extrapolation for this new action to nothing, then as soon as I go past the last keyframe of this action, then I'll see the result from the strips below the new action. Since we took the time to understand how blending and extrapolation works, this shouldn't be hard to understand. Alright, we are kind of done with the really difficult stuff. The star icon, blending modes, extrapolation, and having an active action over the NLA, these are the things that have a high chance to confuse you in the NLA. I hope this presentation so far helps you out in these areas. The rest of the features should be easier to understand. I'll start going through the other options in the side panel. So I'm going to unlink this new action and remove it from my animation data. And I'll select any of the strips and I'll start going through the other options in the end panel from top to bottom, but I'll probably have to jump around the options to explain different related settings. At the top of the end panel, you'll see a text field. It contains the name of the active strip. If I rename it here, you'll see the name update on the strip itself. Let's undo this name change. One thing that can cause uncertainty is if I expand action clip, you'll see another text field which has the same name in it. This here is actually the name of the action that we created at the beginning of this video, and that is attached to this strip here. When we pushed down the action from the action editor to the NLA, Blender automatically gave the strip the same name as the action that it uses. So that's why we have the same names here. But the name of the strip I can change at any point. It is just for organizational purposes. The action field, on the other hand, shows which of the existing actions will be played for this action strip. I can actually click here and select one of the other actions. Usually, you wouldn't change the associated action in this way, but if you wanted to, you can. In this case, I won't, and I'll also undo the name change. Next to the strip name, there is a checkbox. If I click it, that will mute this action strip, or disable it, and it won't be evaluated in the NLA anymore. Notice how this action strip got a dotted line around it, just like when we disable a whole track. So basically the same thing is happening. The only difference is that if we disable an individual strip, only this strip will be disabled, whereas disabling the whole track will disable any other strips that may be on the track. If I move the MoveX track here, you'll see that it automatically becomes disabled because the whole track is disabled. By the way, the shortcut for disabling a strip is H, which is the same shortcut as hiding something in the 3D viewport. Okay, next. something very useful that you can do in the NLA is to change the timing of a whole action. So you can make it faster or slower as a whole very easily and non-destructively, meaning that the original action will not be changed. Only the action strip in the NLA will be changed. Doing this is actually quite simple, but there are a couple of settings here in the end panel related to timing, and explaining how they are related can get a little bit confusing. But one of the easiest way to scale an action is to use the playback scale setting. If I scale it up, this whole action strip will become much longer, and so the action will take much longer to play through. Let's actually start this track to only see this action. And you'll see that the Z movement is taking quite a bit longer than the initial 50 frames that we had. I can also scale it down and make it faster. This way of editing always keeps the beginning of the clip and it tweaks the end of it. Another way to retime this action strip is to use the frame start and frame end options. If I move the frame end, this action will again become longer and thus slower. And I can also move the frame start, and that will affect where this action starts. And this gives us very precise control over the beginning and end of an action. Another easy way to scale an action is using the S shortcut. So if I just press S, this action will be scaled. The scaling of the action is defined by the timeline. So if I have the timeline in the middle, it will scale in both directions. If I place it at the beginning of the action, it will scale away from it. I'll set the frame start and end again to 1 and 50. By the way, with the S shortcut, I can select multiple strips and scale them at the same time. It is important not to confuse the frame start and end under active strip with the very similar settings under action clip. I'll explain the difference in a bit. By the way, notice how when I tweak the frame end, the playback scale is also being affected simultaneously. However, when I tweak the start, the scale is not affected. And I think that is a bug. It should be affected. Just keep that in mind. Before we move on, I want to introduce an important feature of the NLA that will also help us better understand the next points. And that is edit mode for action strips. As you know, in the 3D view, we can press Tab and go to edit mode. And here we can tweak the vertices and polygons of this object. Let's remove the star. And now in the NLA, if I select a strip and press Tab, I'll enter a somewhat similar edit mode for action strips. What happens when I press Tab is Blender automatically sets the action attached to this action strip as the active action here in the action editor. And now I can edit it. I can move keyframes, I can add new ones if I wanted to. And now if I go back to the NLA and press Tab again, I'll be back to the previous state. So the active action will be unlinked and everything will be back to the previous state. Of course, I can set my active action manually here and edit it. But then once I am done editing, I'll have to manually unlink it and so on. So this is just a much faster way to edit an action. Just select it in the NLA, press Tab and edit away. Another advantage of this method is that if I scale this action or move it, the keyframes will stick to it. And if I want to see the unedited action, I can simply click this pin icon here, and that will display the actual keyframes of the action without the retiming of the action strip. And that can be useful because when you edit a scaled action, you can end up with keyframes which are on subframes. So instead of frame 9, your keyframe may be on 9.35. And you may not want that. That is a complex topic and you'll need some practice to get used to it, but I hope this explanation gives you a basic understanding of this feature. And by the way, if you press Shift Tab instead of just Tab, you will again enter edit mode, but your track will also be automatically starred. And that will allow you to just work on your single action without the other strips interfering. And with Shift and Tab again, you'll go back to Unstart mode. And now let's look at this second pair of frame start and frame end settings. If I tweak these settings, the strip will again become longer or shorter, so very similar to what happens with the other settings above. But what really happens is completely different. This is actually very easy to see in edit mode. If I go to edit mode, you'll see that even though my action strip appears longer, the keyframes or the timing was not actually edited. Let's set this to 50 again, and if I tweak these settings, the keyframes will be changed proportionally to the size of the strip, whereas changing this setting will simply make the strip longer or shorter without affecting the keyframes. This allows us to cut parts of the actions. If I don't want the end of this action, I can cut it out. And on the opposite side, we can create this padding at the end of the action, which is mostly useless. More often, you'll want to cut the end of your action. And there is one very practical scenario where this is useful, and that is when you have a looping animation like a walk cycle, in which the first and the last frames are basically the same. And when you repeat this action, you get a little hiccup right where the action repeats. So what you can do is, if your original action is 50 frames, you can set this end setting to 49, and that will remove that last keyframe, and it will make your looping action smoother. Now let's cut this action, and then go out of edit mode by pressing tab, and the length of the strip will jump to the actual length of the action. And that is because this sync length option is on. If I uncheck it, and then go to edit mode, and then edit the end parameter and go out of edit mode, then the length of the strip won't be changed. But if I want to manually sync the length of the strip and the actual action, I can press this now button, and that will make my strip exactly as long as the actual action. Speaking of looping, the NLA has a feature that lets you quickly repeat any action as many times as you want. It is called repeat, and it is right here at the bottom of the end panel. The default value is 1, which means that the whole action will play exactly once. But if I change it to 2, for example, we have a repeating action. Let's star move Z to see it more clearly. We have the cone moving up, and then jumping down and moving up again. This feature is more useful for repeating actions, so let's start the rotate action, select it, give it, let's say, 4 repetitions, and we'll have the cone spinning 4 times. Now this doesn't have to be a whole value. It could be 3.5, for example. So we'll have the cone spin 3 times fully and then spin halfway the 4th time and stop. Another option in the end panel that will be easy to understand is reversed. I'm going to unstart the rotate action and let's start the move Z action instead. And now if I select this strip and enable the reversed option here, the action will play backwards. So this checkbox effectively flips all keyframes of the entire action and makes it play in reverse. It's probably not something that you'll use all the time, but when you do need it, it's nice to be able to invert an entire animation with the click of a button. The checkbox that we have below it, Cyclic Strip Time, I actually don't understand. I tried to figure it out for this video, but I couldn't. Blender's manual explains this checkbox as follows. Cycle the animated time within the action start and end. And if anyone can tell me what that means, I'd be very grateful. I couldn't get this setting to do anything at all. And the final topic that we should cover when it comes to the NLA is influence. The settings that are related to influence are blend in, blend out, and this animated influence checkbox. If we go back to the Photoshop analogy one last time, influence is similar to the opacity of Photoshop layers. One of the most common ways in which you'll be using this feature is through the blend in and blend out settings. Blend in will create Some blending at the beginning of the action and blend out will create blending at the end of the action. When we edit values for these settings, you will see that there is a sloped line that appears at the end of the strip. It's actually a little bit hard to see when we have this strip selected, so if I just click somewhere in the interface, you may be able to see it better. This will help you blend different action strips so that they don't start or end suddenly, and instead they flow smoothly one after the other, or one into the other. Now, this simple scene here served us very well in explaining most of the settings until now, but when it comes to creating smooth transitions between actions, I struggled to create a meaningful example with this cone. The influence and blending makes much more sense in a more complex examples, like when working with a rigged character. So let's leave the detailed explanations for the next video where we'll be working with an actual character. The animated influence checkbox will allow you to control the blending and influence with an action curve. And that gives you full control over the amount of influence that this strip will have throughout the action. The animated strip time feature is actually quite similar. It allows you to control the speed of the action, similar to the playback scale. However, again, you are able to use an action curve, which gives you even more control. I'll try to cover these and other advanced features in the next video. Let's go back to something that I said much earlier in this video. If I unstart this action and let's disable the blending and disable reversed. Now if I go somewhere in the middle of this action and disable the rotate track, the cone will just stay in this rotated state. But the movement actions will be performed as usual. This is because by disabling the rotate action, I removed all existing rotation keyframes. This is something I also mentioned in the previous video, but when there are no keyframes for a certain transformation channel, like rotation, then the object will simply keep the current values that you see on the transform. I can tweak these orientation values any way I want, and the cone will just stay in whatever rotated state I leave it in. And this can be very confusing when working on a more complex scene. One scenario where this confused me a lot was when creating character animations. I would have some actions with the arms in FK mode and others in IK mode, but I'd forget to keyframe the IK-FK switch, and that would just mess up my animations. So I think one of the main lessons that you should take away from this video is to always be aware of the kind of properties that are keyframed in each action in the NLA, because that will affect the way these actions are blended together. Alright, before we wrap things up, let's look at the differences between these pushdown and stash buttons that we have in the action editor. Both of these buttons will move the active action to the NLA. However, there are some differences. Let's quickly create a random action. I'll click the new button and disable all of my NLA tracks so that they don't get in the way. And I'll clear my transforms and I'll create one frame here and just another one randomly. We already gained some experience with the push down button. It will move the new action from the action editor to the top of the NLA stack. And the new track will be active and your strip will be ready to use. Let's undo this and press stash instead. The action will now appear at the bottom of the NLA stack. And the new track was automatically disabled and locked. Other than that, it's a normal track. I can enable it and unlock it at any time, and it will be like any other track. You can use stashing instead of Blender's unintuitive fake user. In the previous video, I mentioned that if an action is not active on any object and it is not tagged with this fake user, this shield icon here, then it will be deleted the next time you save, close, and reopen your scene. But if you stash your action, it becomes part of the NLA and Blender won't delete it. If we look under the list of actions here, you'll see that the new action that I created is not marked with a 0. That is because it is used down here in the NLA. And that's it for this video. I hope it will help you use the NLA and not be confused by it. Tune in next time when we'll do something more fun. We'll work on an animated character and create a little animation for it by blending a bunch of separate actions in the NLA. Thank you to everyone who is supporting me by watching my videos, and special thanks to my Gumroad and Patreon supporters. You rock and help me out a lot. Please click like and subscribe, and talk to you next time.